and welcome to the IEA YouTube channel. I'm Victoria Hewson and I'm Head of Regulatory Affairs here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by energy analyst Kathryn Porter to discuss the energy crisis, how we got here and what we can do about it. Kathryn has a master's degree in physics. She has worked in fascinating roles in financial and energy markets, giving her an unparalleled understanding and expertise in energy markets and regulation. She now runs the What Logic blog and consultancy service, and we'll put a link to the blog in the show notes because I highly recommend to our viewers and listeners that you take a look. So, Kathryn, before we get into the real detail of what's going on here, with energy prices and security and so on. Can you just give us a sort of flavour of your career and what's led you to be one of the most in-demand energy analysts across the media today?
So it's a fairly unconventional background, I suppose. After my degree, I came into the city and worked in various banks, initially in financial services, capital markets, focusing on the technology sector. I was a casualty of the dot-com bust, went to do an MBA and then went back into banking, initially in fixed income, and then I moved to commodities and then specialised in energy. And I spent a few years bouncing between the trading floors of banks and the trading floors of utilities. And then about 6 years ago, when I left my last sort of conventional role for health reasons, expecting just to take a short break, and I started my blog. And before I got to the end of my sort of 6 months of break, people had been reading my blog and started asking me to do projects for them. So I have a social media-led energy consulting business, which wasn't really what I expected.
Yeah, well, it's a great service, it's actually very refreshing, I think, to read your kind of analysis and commentary from someone who has obviously got a very good understanding of so many of the really complex geopolitical and actually sort of the pricing implications, a lot of which seems to me is driven by not just the laws of supply and demand, but the laws of physics, right? Mm. So I think it's great that you can bring all of those together in your commentary. But let's get into this discussion of what's actually gone wrong here with the energy crunch, the prices for consumers that we've seen leaping up. The price caps turned out to be no help whatsoever. Small businesses are looking at bills going up by multiples, orders of magnitude. And we even have problems really of security of supply with threats of blackouts and rationing throughout the winter. So what do you think has gone wrong here? Can we blame the war in Ukraine and bad luck, or do you think there are bigger questions to be asked about the lawmakers and the regulators who have been designing and supervising our energy markets for these past decades?
Okay, I'll say yes. Right, so I think we need to separate the issues of price and security of supply. The price concerns are primarily due to external factors which realistically couldn't have been anticipated. About a year ago, prices started rising as an artefact of COVID, in fact. So during COVID, we saw significant reductions in demand, but actually supply reduced even more. And I think it was the largest reduction in gas supply since the 1970s, if not ever. And certainly some of the American producers expected those reductions to be permanent because they were hearing the rhetoric from Biden, and there was an expectation that, in this new sort of anti-fossil fuel era, that production wouldn't come back. And so they let the staff go and they pretty much shut up shop in some cases. Now, after the pandemic started to ease, demand recovered much faster than supply did. And there was an expectation that should rebalance round about now. But then, unfortunately, we had the invasion of the Ukraine. And that's prompted buyers in Europe in particular to want to move away from using Russian gas. Now, there's not enough gas in the rest of the world to displace Russian gas. So that's creating an artificial gap between supply and demand, which is pushing up prices very significantly. So this isn't something that could have been anticipated. You mentioned the price cap not doing its job. So the price cap was never there to protect consumers from cost going up. It was really a measure to overcome some perceived disbenefits to consumers because of the way that it was felt the market wasn't working in a very competitive way. I think some of the drivers of that have since been challenged. But in any case, the price cap is supposed to be cost reflective, and suppliers are supposed to be able to recover their costs. Last year, when the cap was only being reset every 6 months, a lot of suppliers went bankrupt because suddenly they couldn't recover their costs under the cap. And there was a regulatory failure around that. You know, having half of the market fail all at once is not, what you want, and not an example of a well-ordered market. When it comes to security of supply, on the other hand, I think this is where we're seeing policy errors. Effectively, what we've been doing in recent years through the energy transition is replacing conventional thermal and nuclear generation with intermittent wind. We're not the only country that's been doing this. Some countries can do that better than others. So if you've got somewhere like Australia where it's very sunny over wide areas for large amounts of time, there's less intermittency. But countries like Britain and Germany and parts of the US, having these wind-led transitions, we get into trouble when it's not windy. And early on in the transition, I think there was an expectation that it would always be windy somewhere. But we've really discovered that's not true. Last autumn, in September, we had 3 weeks where there was low wind output, not just in Britain, but across the whole of Northern Europe. If Britain and Germany have low wind at the same time, then we're trying to suck electricity in from the neighbouring markets. Now, unfortunately, as well as having this gas crisis, the two countries that typically export, France and Norway, have their own specific challenges right now. And aren't able to offer those exports. And so that's why we actually could very well see rationing this winter, when if there's low wind output, we'll struggle to meet demand.
So let me ask a bit more about this rush to renewables, and in Britain that has broadly meant wind and I guess a bit of solar. And we quite often now hear politicians and sort of green activist campaigners talking about cheap renewables, and their argument is that in the present circumstances, actually that illustrates why we need to move away from gas and fossil fuels, because obviously they cost a lot of money at present, whereas renewables are cheap. And it's this mantra now that I've seen quite a few politicians like Chris Skidmore using, cheap renewables, and it seems to me it's one of these formulations that gets repeated until people believe it, a bit like strong and stable or something like that. Can you explain a bit, because I think in your blog you make the case that actually renewables aren't cheap. But I suppose, there's something to be said for the intuitive idea that, well, the wind is free, nobody owns or can crunch supply of the wind, so intuitively you would think that solar and wind would be cheap, but actually there's a lot more to it than that.
If you're happy to only have electricity when it's sunny or windy, then sure, it's relatively cheap, although it does have very high capital costs. And we've been subsidising wind generation in this country for more than 20 years. So I think that's one of the first things to ask is, how is an industry not sufficiently mature after 20 years that it's still requiring so many subsidies? We're spending £10.5 billion a year subsidising renewable generation, and that figure's only going up because the legacy subsidy programmes have a leveraging effect in some of them, and so they're going to keep going up even though CFD prices are coming down for many years to come. So assuming that you don't just want to have electricity when it's windy and sunny, you then have to take care of what else happens. So you're subsidising the capacity to build wind and solar because the market cannot support those by itself. But then you have to subsidise capacity to be available when it's not windy or sunny. And that's being done through the capacity market. So now you're effectively having an electricity system that's twice as big as it needs to be because you've got your wind and solar capacity, but that might not be available. So when it's not windy at night, for example, you'll have pretty much no intermittent renewables on the system. So then you need the capacity market to bring in dispatchable generation, so gas, nuclear, things like biomass, although that has its own challenges. Okay, so now that's also billions of pounds, so you're paying for that. Now, unfortunately, a lot of these renewables are being built in places where there isn't very much network infrastructure, and you can't bring the energy that they generate.
Because the offshore wind farms are offshore.
Well,
by
exactly, and
definition.
factories don't tend to be.
Yes,
So,
yes.
so if you can't bring that generation to the places it's needed, it has to be curtailed. And because they're receiving subsidies that only get paid when they generate, they don't appreciate being curtailed. So now the consumer has to pay curtailment costs. So that's the third time they pay for that capacity. And then you have to think about the physics you mentioned before. We expect that when we press that light switch, the electricity will be there immediately. To do that, the grid has to be balanced in real time. So every second, supply has to meet demand within really tight parameters. And actually, if that doesn't happen, then things literally start self-disconnecting. There's protection measures in various network equipments and so on, because electrical equipment really can't cope with that imbalance. It basically causes the frequency of voltage and current to change, and in an alternating current system, and equipment just can't cope with that.
Right.
And so because wind and solar are very intermittent and they vary from moment to moment, this is making the variability of the whole grid much higher. So it's not just the demand side, which has always been variable. You know, you can't predict most of the time when people are going to turn on lights or exactly. So there's that variability, but now we have the wind and solar variability. You know, a cloud passing in front of the sun makes a difference. Each puff of wind can make a difference. And so National Grid has to use all sorts of tools to make sure that supply and demand is really properly balanced in real time. And that's the cost of that's going up really
because
significantly.
there's essentially so much duplication.
Well, because it's so variable. So it's becoming more difficult. Before, when you had demand was variable but generation wasn't, then you could match it pretty well. You know, you'd have your power stations that would run in base load, and then you had peaking plants, and then you'd have super peaking plant like your pumped hydro that can respond really quickly. Now you're needing to have batteries, but you didn't have batteries at all before, so you've had to subsidise them to get built. You're really relying on thermal generation to provide, it's called inertia. It's basically a resistance to those changes in frequency and of the voltage when that happens when you don't match supply and demand properly. But of course, you've not got as much of that. And wind and solar can't provide that inertia. So the physics doesn't really work as well. And so that's also expensive. And so you're paying for all of these things. You're paying for the subsidies for renewables to be built. You're paying for the subsidies for backup generation. You're paying the curtailment costs. You're paying the extra network costs to connect them all up. And now you're paying all these extra balancing costs. So it's just not true to say that renewables are cheaper. When you add up the cost of the consumer, you find that they're not. And if you draw a chart, which I have on my blog, of wholesale gas and electricity prices over the last 20 years, and also end user, like domestic consumer prices over the same period, you see that the end user prices have just gone up and gone up and gone up, whereas wholesale prices have just done something completely different. Sometimes they've gone up, sometimes they've gone down. There's no parallel trend. And that's because of these hidden costs of the energy transition.
The system.
Exactly.
Gosh, that's all rather worrying, really. But that's really fascinating. I hadn't really understood quite a few of those aspects of it, I must admit. Now, that's obviously sort of in part led us to where we are with the difficulties that people are going to be experiencing with their bills and so on. Now, in one of your blogs, you wrote, I think it was a 14-point plan to rescue or repair energy markets to try and lead us out of this situation. And I think, was that the one where you also wrote about a proper understanding of sustainability as being something perhaps related to, but not completely the same as decarbonisation? And I wondered if you could walk us through some of those points, if you can remember them. Your maybe not all 14. your top 2 or 3 recommendations for the sort of, I don't mean the immediate sort of actions of the Treasury in perhaps helping people pay their bills with cash handouts or cash tax cuts, whatever it is. I'm talking about the sort of structural fixes that you think we need to start putting in place to lead us out of this in the mid to long term.
So that point about sustainability, I think, is an important one, because at the moment we've been very focused on carbon, and the problem with that is that it can lead us down into making choices that have other harms. You know, for example, is it good to have more dirty water in the pursuit of cleaner air? And when you put it that way, most people would say, no, that doesn't sound very good. But in fact, that's what our drive towards electric vehicles and lithium-ion batteries does, because the production and processing of lithium is extremely polluting of water sources. We're seeing disputes in South America over access to water, because that water then can't be used for irrigation or for drinking and so on. Batteries also use a lot of cobalt. Cobalt is being mined extensively in the Congo, where they're using child labour. Do we want to build our energy transition on the shoulders of 11-year-olds? 60% of the world's polysilicon is manufactured in the Xinjiang province of China, and this is going into solar panels. Of course, there are forced labour issues there. So again, I think there are wider ethical considerations that we really need to factor in. And this also feeds into this question about geopolitics. We've been focusing a lot on the exposure to gas coming from Russia, but a lot of these minerals are they're under Chinese control effectively. And so we risk swapping one geopolitical problem for another geopolitical problem if we don't pay enough attention to that. So I think we need to have a much wider approach to what we mean by sustainability. And as part of that, and one of my 14 points is around demand reduction. We really should stop pushing this problem of addressing the issue of heat losses in homes down the line. You know, we've sort of picked off the low-hanging fruit with loft insulation and tank insulation and so on. And I think the reason that policymakers have shied away from this is now there aren't any sort of one-size-fits-all plug-and-play solutions to this problem. You pretty much have to go property by property and sort them out. And you have to do it properly, because if you don't, you'll create other problems like moisture bridging issues that lead to damp. And a house that's damp will feel cold, even if it isn't, and so people will turn heating up. And of course, there are all sorts of health disbenefits of living in damp
as well
homes.
as it being a waste of money that essentially ends up being sucked up by sort of rent-seeking intermediaries, which is something we've seen a lot of.
Exactly. So the people say, well, you can't fix what you can't measure. So the first step is to measure the heat losses in homes. So we should be doing thermal imaging testing. The EPC needs to be completely reformed.
Oh, interesting.
The Energy Performance Certificate, first of all, it doesn't tell you a single thing about energy efficiency. It is explicitly a cost measure. It tells you, relatively speaking, how expensive it is to heat your home. Because electricity is more expensive than gas, if you have electric heating, with some exceptions, you will have a worse EPC than if you have gas heating. So I have direct experience of this. We renovated our home and we replaced some of the gas radiators with electric heating, and our EPC rating went from a D to an F. And the assessor said if we wanted to go back to a D, we should just put the radiators back.
You're really worrying me now, because I'm in the process of applying for a mortgage and it's a green product and it's conditional on having an A or B rated EPC, which I'm in the process of finding out whether the property I'm buying will have this. It's a renovation. But you're basically saying the more expensive the heating is, the worse your certificate is, and it's not really got to do with how well insulated or how well designed it is.
No, and it's all based on assumptions that are, you know, what the age of the property was. They assume it was built using the construction method of the day, which might not be the case. in our building, we'd added underfloor insulation, which I could evidence. I had photographs and invoices, but I got no credit for it at all. In fact, I got a recommendation that I install underfloor insulation. Yeah, exactly, which was quite irritating. And so these assumptions might not be correct. I've written other blogs on my website that talk about the errors in the EPC process as well. So there are just straight up mistakes in the way they're calculated. The same property can be assessed by different people 1 or 2 years apart and get different ratings. And the EPC does not have any provision for the condition of properties. So that doesn't explain why it might be different 1 year to the next. If you have 2 identical homes, except one has perfect single glazed windows and the other one has smashed up broken double glazed windows with missing panes, the double glazed house will have a better EPC rating despite obviously having worse heat losses.
But we are using these EPC ratings as a sort of proxy for deciding how well we've done at insulating our homes,
Exactly.
basically. But it sounds like from what you're saying that it doesn't really mean anything. We might well be deceiving ourselves. So
it doesn't incentivize the best actions. So
how,
if you've got those broken windows,
yes,
the EPC doesn't incentivize you to fix them. It'll incentivize you to go and install. One of my recommendations was a wind turbine, because all rural properties by definition get told to have a wind turbine. The fact that I live in a conservation area and would never get permission, it doesn't factor into that either. Whereas if I had broken windows, that would be actually the best thing I could do.
Yes, well, it seems to me that a lot of this, the insulation question in particular, does actually come back to our terrible housing market and planning laws. I'm thinking here in particular of the difficulty of getting landlords to insulate their property when they don't pay the bills, so they will see no benefit from it, and we don't have a competitive housing market, so there's no incentive for landlords to insulate and improve the energy efficiency of their properties, because tenants will rent them come what may, because the housing market is so broken. So this seems to me like another example where we need to improve these long-term structural issues so that we can bring market forces to bear actually and start incentivizing landlords to insulate their properties.
But a very simple way of doing that would be to make the cost of home improvements a deductible from rent.
Right.
And then the householder themselves can carry out the repairs and just knock the cost off the rent. Now, obviously, you don't want to create a free-for-all and destroy the rental market, but I think that central government can be setting targets and rules for this, which would be enforced by local councils. They already control the planning process and the building control process. So what they could do is have a certification scheme where a tenant would approach their council and say, I want to carry out these works, my landlord isn't willing to do it. Will you certify the works are appropriate? Then certify that they've been done in accordance with the plan, and then certify a payment scheme where you deduct the cost of that from the rent over some defined period of time. So then the landlord still gets an appropriate income, but it's just reduced as you amortise this cost over time.
That sounds like a good idea.
There are ways of dealing with this that don't make you force landlords into doing stuff they don't want to do. Just be like, well, okay, your rent will get reduced, so you can choose either do it yourself or your tenant will do it, and then you'll receive a lower rental income for a period.
That sounds like a neat solution that would make some inroads right into the rental market, which I assume is where a lot of these homes are sitting that haven't yet had any of the necessary work done to them. So on to another thorny issue, nuclear. Why is nuclear so difficult and so costly to build? And I guess the other side of that question, how do we make it less costly and just such a long drawn out process to get it built? Without, and to be absolutely clear, I'm not talking about cutting corners or deregulating so that we have any cowboy can set up a small modular reactor, but there must be some barriers there that are disproportionate and unnecessary and hold us back. A colleague of mine was just reading an old news article the other day from, I think, Britain's first nuclear reactor in the 1950s, was announced by the Secretary of State and then opened by the Queen 3 years later. And yet now it takes decades of wrangling and phenomenally complex financing arrangements.
It was a tiny weeny little reactor though. It was like a little baby reactor.
I'm sure, yes, it's probably not an ideal comparison point, but there must be, what are the reasons why it's become so phenomenally difficult and costly, and how do we break down some of those barriers? Because I think I'm right in saying nuclear is such an important part of the energy mix to get us out of the current instability.
It is, and I think we absolutely need to build more nuclear reactors. I think there are questions, though, around the technology choices. So we've gone down this road of using uranium, and that was because governments were very interested in the military applications of plutonium, which is effectively a byproduct of that process. We now have more plutonium than anybody could ever wish for making as many weapons as they could ever want, ever.
Yay.
In the world. so there's no longer any reason to continue with uranium for that reason. And there are alternatives. Thorium reactors were developed in the 50s and then put to one side because of this sort of military desire. So that, you know, people are doing a little bit of work around thorium again, and that's not ready to come to market. But looking sort of medium to long term, that should definitely be a consideration. Those reactors are also cheaper and they're safer. One of the reasons that nuclear power is as expensive as it is the capital costs are really high. Yeah. Now, I actually do think that there are issues within the regulatory process, particularly after the Fukushima disaster. Regulations in Europe were tightened in a way that I think wasn't entirely appropriate. We're just not going to get a 15-metre tsunami in Europe. That's just not going to happen. Right. So we shouldn't be trying to regulate as if it might happen. And it's a funny thing because you think, oh, you can't possibly make nuclear too safe. Well, you might say, well, building your house with 3-metre thick walls will make it more resilient to earthquakes, but it doesn't mean it's a sensible thing to do. So I think we need to look at the nuclear regulations and make sure that they are actually fit for purpose. The other thing that we should do, and the government has indicated it wants to do this, which is leverage the approvals process that's already been done by other countries. So you've got countries like the US and Japan and South Korea. They're not, laid back and relaxed. Right. They've got, when it comes to technology certification, they have very robust processes. The Fukushima disaster was not a technology-related problem. It was because they hadn't put their backup processes in a way that was insulated from the tsunami risk, which they had already identified, they just hadn't got around to dealing with. The technology itself was fine and none of their reactors were damaged in the earthquake. It was what happened afterwards that was the problem. So we should be leveraging the work of those other regulators. We shouldn't be reinventing the wheel every time somebody comes up with a new technology. So one of the alternatives in Britain was proposed as an advanced boiling water reactor. They were built in Japan before Fukushima in under 5 years, and they were delivered on time and on budget. And yet we went down the European pressurised water reactor route. They've not yet been delivered in Europe after more than 20 years of trying.
Right.
So we've not made good technology choices, and part of this is because we haven't been brave enough when it comes to authorising new technologies, which aren't actually really new. When when they're already built and running somewhere else, we should be able to take some comfort from that. We shouldn't be needing to do everything from scratch. So that is one area where we could improve.
That's really fascinating, actually, because I'm a big believer in recognition of safe countries' regulatory standards in goods trade, and I must admit it hadn't occurred to me that there was a similar argument for nuclear technology. So that sounds like a great idea for the incoming business secretary at BEIS, the Energy Department, whoever that will be. That sounds like a great opportunity that they could take forward and make some difference.
I think the other thing with nuclear is that because the capital costs are so high, the government ties itself up in all of these knots to try and incentivise private investment.
And keep it off the government's balance sheet.
But you see, I don't think it should do that. I think there's an argument to say, physical security is something that the government pays for directly. Nobody expects the private sector to finance the military or the police. So why should the government not take a similar approach to a portion of electricity supply? Not all of it, but a certain amount that could be there to guarantee security of supply. And just flat out build the nuclear and pay for it itself. That would also cut a lot of time and effort from these processes. You no longer need to persuade the market to do anything. You work with foreign regulators who've certified the technology. You find some providers who can do it, maybe have a tender, and then you sign a contract and pay for it and build it, And with these advanced boiling water reactors, that construction time was 5 years. Mm-hmm. If they got up and decided to do that right now, we might even get one open before Hinkley Point.
It seems to me that if there isn't a market solution here where it's going to be possible for private providers to get in and build nuclear power stations privately in their own sort of commercial interests, then I think the next best thing has surely got to be, rather than all this extremely over-engineered private financing arrangements, it does sound like the government should just get on and build it and treat it as national infrastructure potentially, although that's probably not a very IEA thing to say, so I'll have to contend with colleagues' comments on that later.
But it's not for everything. I don't think we should nationalise the entire energy industry. This is just one portion of it. Mm-hmm. We need it for security of supply. Security is actually the job of the government, so why should it not finance that?
I think that does make a lot of sense in this particular instance, especially if, as you described it, the government's actually, contracting out, tendering out the actual works to private technology and construction companies. Mm. That does seem to make a lot of sense. Let me finish with another forward-looking question. How do we regulate for innovation in this sector? In particular, I'm thinking, so I was lucky enough to be invited to speak to the Ofgem board a few months ago. And at the time I was doing a lot of work on ideas about encouraging innovation through regulatory procedures and regulatory policy. And I was a bit troubled by some of the things that are in some of the Ofgem codes for especially retail suppliers that I think will deter innovation in the way that we receive and contract for electricity supplies, in particular as things like electricity as a service and the bundling of electricity with devices, for example, might become more popular. And I'm a bit worried that the way the Ofgem supplier codes work at the moment will make it actually quite difficult for new challenger suppliers, or say Google or Tesco's, to get involved in these new innovative ways of supplying retail energy. Now, arguably, the retail energy market is in such a mess at the moment that we perhaps don't have the headspace to even think about those kinds of things, but I think we should be thinking about them and should be trying to encourage innovation in this area. What do you think would be some ideas that would actually be pro-innovation market, pro-innovation regulations?
I think that Ofgem and the government need to change the way they look at suppliers. The reason we don't have innovation is because Ofgem and the government seem so obsessed with the idea that suppliers are greedy profiteers, right, that they've regulated them so tightly it's impossible for them to make any money. And that's why, the supermarkets did toy with the retail energy market and they exited, and the technology companies have never come in. Why would you want to enter a highly regulated market where you make extremely small margins? And at every opportunity, the government and Ofgem tell people that you're greedy profiteers and can't be trusted.
Yes,
and all that
undoubtedly,
language.
Any new innovative thing that you come up with will be criticised as somehow exploiting people if it turns out that it doesn't work out for them. Yeah. So there's a strong disincentive to try anything new.
And you look at the language Ofgem uses when it describes suppliers, it's always clamping down on this, and it's just not the right way to do it. It's hostile, it's confrontational. And this is not just Ofgem, the government is as bad, and it's not just the current government. This has been true really since privatisation. There's the notion that energy companies making profits is somehow a dirty word. Now, right now, we have energy inflation, and it's all over the news that energy companies are making record profits, and this is obscene. Of course, it's not the same energy companies that supply to our houses. We also have massive food inflation, but we're not hearing a single noise about how food companies or supermarkets are ripping people off. It's just an entirely different conversation, and it really needs to stop. You know, it's not wrong for energy companies to make profits. In years when they make losses, nobody's giving them handouts. You know, nobody's going, oh, you know, Shell, they drilled some dry wells this year, let's give them some money. You know, that just doesn't happen. So we've really got to change the narrative around this, and we have to allow companies to make profits. If we're not going to let them be profitable, there is absolutely no incentive for them to innovate. They're just scraping along at the bottom,
Yes.
just delivering the bare minimum. And this is why you have terrible customer service, because there's no ability to make profit. There's no scope to invest more in your back office, because
to differentiate yourself.
Exactly, because you cannot make any money from it. You'll do the bare minimum that you can that avoids you being fined for not giving enough customer service, and that's it. You know, so we need to allow suppliers to earn more profits, to remove some of the regulations. It's a stupidly over-regulated market, and it's the wrong type of regulation. Why are suppliers expected to install smart meters? We're the only country in the world that's doing that. This is network equipment. It should be installed by network companies. Why do we expect suppliers to distribute welfare on the part of the government? The government should be distributing welfare, not suppliers. They shouldn't be doing that. They shouldn't have to get the DWP to give them the information about which customers are vulnerable and should get the warm home discount. The DWP should just deal with it.
Yes.
Why should suppliers have to worry about insulating people's homes? Suppliers don't know anything about the construction industry. They're just price takers in all of that. The energy company obligations should be run by councils. So there's all of these different things that suppliers are expected to do. Green levies. Why, you know, suppliers are not there to collect taxes on behalf of the government either. That should be done through general taxation, and suppliers should not be involved in that at all. It's just, you know, it's just crazy. The government has been trying to exploit the fact that suppliers own the customer relationship, and it's layered on all of these obligations, but at the same time not allowing them to make any profits. And then they wonder why nobody's innovating. They wonder why people like Google aren't coming in the market.
Yeah.
It's like, who on earth would?
Well, that's slightly depressing, but I think to take a positive away from it, it certainly indicates there's a lot of scope for some improvements that you would think could be made rather swiftly by a government that truly did believe in innovation and free markets. So there's a challenge to the next Secretary of State for Business and Energy. Kathryn, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for your time. That's been absolutely fascinating, and I will watch with interest to see how many of your recommendations and ideas get taken forward. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please do subscribe and support us through our Patreon account, which is linked to in the notes below. Thanks again, and bye for now.
Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.